What if I told you that most of your suffering isn't caused by what happened to you, but by your refusal to let it go? What if the emotional weight you carry, the baggage you defend, the stories you rehearse every day in your mind are not keeping you safe, but keeping you small? Carl Jung, one of the most profound minds in psychological history, didn't just explore the unconscious, he mapped a path to liberation from it. He believed that the chains that bind us emotionally are rarely external, but they are forged in the psyche, reinforced by habit, and held in place by fear. But here's the key: what was created inside can be dismantled inside. And that's what this journey is about, breaking emotional chains through Jung's blueprint for letting go. We begin with a paradox. Letting go is one of the hardest things a human being can do, yet it's also one of the most natural. The body lets go. The seasons let go. Nature sheds constantly. But the mind clings. It clings to identity, to pain, to stories, to roles. And Jung would ask, why? Why do we attach so fiercely to things that hurt us, limit us, or no longer serve us? The answer is not weakness. It's fear. The fear of losing a part of ourselves. Because to the ego, even pain is familiar, and familiarity feels safe. So we hold on. But we rationalize. We say, I can't let it go, it's part of who I am. But Jung would challenge that. He'd say, if it's killing your spirit, it's not who you are. It's who you were taught to be.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
Let's get brutally honest. How much of your current identity is built around a wound, around a betrayal, around a belief that was never truly yours? Most people don't realize it, but they're living in a loop, a pattern encoded by an emotional event that was never processed. And Jung's work makes this clear. What you do not make conscious will control you from the shadows, and you will call it fate. That's the emotional chain. That's the cycle. And we don't break it by pretending it's not there. We break it by bringing it into the light. Let me ask you a question that could change everything. What emotion are you afraid to feel fully, because deep down you know it will require you to change your entire life? That emotion is your teacher. That emotion is your portal. Because the only way to let go is to go through. Not around, not above, not below. Through. You must feel what you've been avoiding. You must grieve what you've been carrying. You must face the part of yourself that is still stuck in a moment, a memory, a pattern, and free it. Not because someone tells you to, but because your future depends on it. Jung believed that letting go was not passive. It was not weakness. It was an act of spiritual authority. It meant saying, I am no longer willing to be defined by this pain. I am no longer willing to let this emotion hijack my choices. But I am no longer willing to betray my potential in the name of protecting my story. That's not denial. That's transformation. That's how we begin to rewire the psyche. Now let's get practical. Jung's blueprint for letting go begins with awareness. You cannot release what you cannot name. So the first step is to look at your emotional life like a scientist. What triggers you? What patterns repeat? What stories do you tell yourself when you're afraid, ashamed, or angry? Write them down, not to judge, but to observe, because observation creates distance, and distance creates choice. Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, It will direct your life, and you will call it fate. That means every moment you bring awareness to a pattern, you weaken its grip. Step 2 is integration. This is where most people get stuck. They identify the wound, but then try to fix it, avoid it, or erase it. But Jung taught that the goal is not to eliminate the shadow. It's to integrate it. That means you stop treating your pain like an enemy. You start asking it questions. What was it trying to protect you from? What lesson did it offer? What strength did it forge? Integration is not about forgetting. It's about reclaiming. When you integrate a wound, it becomes wisdom. When you shun it, it becomes baggage. Step 3 is ritual release. Jung understood the power of the symbolic mind. He believed that transformation isn't just intellectual, it's ritualistic. So letting go must involve more than thought. It must involve action. Burn the letter. Write the goodbye. Visit the place. Speak the truth. Create a physical release that represents an internal shift. Because the psyche responds to symbols. That's why dreams are symbolic. That's why myths are powerful. You must speak the language of your soul, and your soul speaks through ritual. And finally, step 4 is re-identification. You must ask, who am I without this story? Because once you let go of one identity, there is a void. And if you don't fill it consciously, the old pattern will return, dressed in new clothes. So create a new narrative, not a fantasy but an upgrade, a version of you that is forged not in fear, but in freedom. Jung believed that the highest goal of the psyche was not happiness, it was wholeness. And wholeness means becoming someone who is no longer ruled by the past. But let me ask you another question and sit with it deeply. What would your life look like if you stopped carrying every emotional chain you inherited? Who would you be if you didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore? What would you create if you weren't afraid of being seen in your rawest truth? Because here's the thing, emotional freedom is not a gift. It's a conquest. And it begins the moment you stop saying, "This is just how I am," and start saying, "This is who I choose to become." Jung's blueprint is not a shortcut, it's a roadmap for the brave. The ones willing to plunge into the unconscious, rescue their forgotten parts, and return to the surface whole. Not perfect, not polished, but whole. And when you become whole, something magical happens. The chains fall off, not all at once, sometimes link by link, but steadily, powerfully, irreversibly. And you begin to live not in reaction, but in response, not in survival, but in sovereignty. And that, Jung would say, is the point of it all. Emotional alchemy, turning pain into power through Jungian integration. But if the first step is to break the chains, then the second is to forge something new from the shattered metal. Carl Jung didn't just want us to let go of suffering, he wanted us to transmute it. To take the raw, chaotic, painful material of our lives and turn it into meaning, direction, and strength. This is emotional alchemy. And while it sounds poetic, it's one of the most rigorous psychological processes a human can undergo. Because to turn pain into power, you must first own it. Not as a victim, not as a martyr, but as a creator, one who says, "This pain will not define me. It will refine me." Let's begin with the image of the alchemist. For centuries, Alchemists tried to turn base metals into gold. But Jung saw it differently. He believed alchemy was never about literal gold, it was a metaphor for psychological transformation. The base metal is your unconscious pain. The gold is your integrated, authentic self. And the fire, the crucible, the pressure of the process, that's your life, your relationships, your heartbreaks, your failures, your rage, your grief, all of it. A sacred fire that doesn't burn you down, it burns you clean. So how does this process work practically, emotionally, spiritually? It begins first with radical presence. Because you cannot heal what you are still running from. You have to be still enough to feel, and to sit with the ache, to listen to the wound without rushing to fix it. Jung called this active imagination, a technique where you allow the unconscious to speak, to show itself, often through symbols, dreams, or images. But in everyday life, it means something simple but hard. Slow down. Stop numbing. Stop distracting. Stop blaming. Ask yourself, what is this pain trying to teach me? Not what is wrong with me, but what is emerging through me. This is the first layer of emotional alchemy, awareness without judgment. Because pain is not the enemy. Pain is the signal, the messenger. And most of us have been taught to kill the messenger. We medicate, we escape, we stay positive. But Jung would ask, what if the pain is sacred? What if it contains the very wisdom you've been praying for? What if it's not here to punish you but to reveal you? The second layer is dialogue. This is where Jung's genius truly shines. He didn't believe in just analyzing the mind, he believed in communing with it. That means when a painful emotion arises, you don't suppress it. You speak to it. You ask it questions. You give it a voice. You say, what do you need from me? What are you protecting me from? When did you first appear in my life? This is not imagination. This is inner work. For a conversation between your conscious self and your unconscious parts. And when you do this, something stunning happens. The emotion softens. It no longer needs to scream, because it has finally been heard. The third layer is symbolic embodiment. Jung knew that the psyche speaks in images, not logic. That's why letting go and transformation often require ritual. You don't just think your way out of pain. You dance it, you draw it, you write it. You sculpt it, you breathe it, you give it form so it can be reshaped. This is how emotional energy is released, not through willpower, but through expression. Ask yourself, what is my pain trying to become? That's a question most people never ask. But the answer is everything. Because pain doesn't want to stay pain. It wants to be transformed into purpose. Let me give you a real-life example. Consider someone who has spent years feeling rejected. Every relationship ends the same way. They always feel not enough. The pattern repeats like a curse. But when they turn inward, when they stop blaming others and start dialoguing with the wound, they realize something shocking. The feeling of rejection didn't start with their last partner. It started when they were 7 and a parent withheld love to control them. That child, the rejected self, got frozen in time. And ever since, the adult has been chasing love to heal what was never theirs to carry. This is the moment of emotional alchemy, when a wound becomes a revelation. When you stop asking, why is this happening to me? and start asking, what is this waking up inside me? That's when the energy shifts. That's when the chain breaks. Not because you let it go in some surface level way, but because you finally understood it. And what is understood can be transformed. But the final layer of this process, the gold, is action. Jung was clear, insight without action is sterile. Once you've understood the wound, once you've integrated the shadow, once you've reclaimed the lost part of yourself, you must live differently. You must make new choices, speak new words, set new boundaries, because otherwise the transformation dies in theory. But when you act from your new knowing, you don't just break emotional chains, you forge a new self. And this is what makes Jung's blueprint so powerful. It doesn't ask you to become someone else. It asks you to become more fully yourself, the self you were before the pain, yes, but also the self who has been forged by it. That's the paradox. The wound doesn't make you weaker. It makes you wider, more compassionate, more discerning, more powerful, but only if you do the work. So I'll ask you this: what pain in your life are you ready to turn into power? Be honest. Don't pick the easy one. Pick the one you've been running from. The one that still makes your voice shake. That's the one with the gold in it. That's the one that, if you're brave enough to meet it fully, will change not just your life but your identity. Because when you break an emotional chain, you don't just feel better. You become someone else, someone freer, someone clearer, someone who no longer reacts but responds, someone who no longer hides but reveals, someone who no longer waits but creates, becoming the phoenix, rebirth through fire and the return of the true self. We've broken the chains. We've transmuted pain into power. But Jung's blueprint doesn't stop at healing, it ends in rebirth. Like the phoenix rising from its own ashes, the soul that has endured the fire of emotional alchemy doesn't just return to what it was. It becomes something entirely new. And more than that, it becomes true. This is the final transformation, the return of the authentic self. The self that was buried beneath layers of trauma, programming, and performance. And it's the most terrifying and liberating thing you will ever experience. Let's begin with a question Jung would love. Who were you before the world told you who to be? Not in a nostalgic sense, but in a symbolic one. The phoenix doesn't mourn its ashes, it needs them. Because without the burning, it cannot fly. In the same way, your breakdowns, your betrayals, your darkest nights, they weren't detours. They were initiations into maturity, into consciousness, into wholeness. Jung believed that the individuation process, the journey of becoming your true self, requires the death of the false self. And that death is always painful, but it's also sacred. Here's the paradox: you cannot be reborn until you're willing to let a part of you die, the part that needed approval, the part that feared rejection, the part that clung to control, the part that wore the mask so well, even you forgot it was a mask. This is not metaphor. This is psychological death. And Jung warned us, most people will resist this process. Because the ego doesn't want to die. It wants to survive. It wants to stay in control. But the soul wants to expand. And expansion always requires letting go of identities that were never yours to begin with. So what does this look like in real life? It looks like finally leaving the relationship that you stayed in because you feared being alone. It looks like quitting the job that stole your spirit because it gave you status. It looks like telling the truth about who you are, even if it costs you community, comfort, or certainty. It looks like burning the version of you that played small so others didn't feel insecure. Because here's what Jung would say: you can only become whole when you stop negotiating with your own truth. And when you do, when you truly let the false self die, you come back on fire. Not wildfire, not destructive fire, but refined fire. Clear fire. The kind of inner power that doesn't scream, doesn't prove, doesn't seek because it simply is. This is the phoenix moment. The moment you realize you don't need to be fixed, you need to be revealed. Because the real you was never broken. The real you was just buried. And now, after all the burning, all the releasing, all the facing, there's nothing left to hide behind. You stand in the open, naked, whole, free. And the world, for the first time, meets the truth of you. But here's where the final test comes in. Because the world might not clap, it might not understand. People may still treat you as they treated your former self, and you will be tempted to go back, to dim again, to shrink again, to wear the mask again. Don't, because once the phoenix rises, it cannot return to the nest. Your job now is not to explain your wings, it's to fly. And this is where your legacy begins. Not in what you've overcome, but in what you've become. You're no longer chained to the past. You're no longer addicted to patterns. You're no longer stuck in emotional loops. You are living from the center of your truth. And that truth begins to attract a different life. Not overnight. Not with fireworks, but steadily, powerfully, authentically. You start speaking with clarity. People listen. You start walking with purpose. People move. You start loving without losing yourself. People rise. Because the phoenix doesn't need to convince anyone it's real. It just needs to burn once and return whole. Let me ask you something to end this journey. What are you still afraid to burn? What part of your life, your identity, your narrative, are you still holding on to even though you know it's not you anymore? That's the final chain. That's the last weight. And when you're ready to let it go, not out of anger, but out of reverence, you will finally be free. Not just healed. Free. Carl Jung mapped this for us. He showed us that the psyche is not a prison, it's a labyrinth. And at the center of that labyrinth is not a monster. It's you, the real you, the one who is no longer afraid to feel, no longer afraid to face, no longer afraid to fly. So break the chain, light the match, rise from the ashes, and never look back.